I keep the receipt from the cantina in Chihuahua in my left breast pocket. It's wrinkled past reading now. The ink has bled into the paper until the figures are ghosts of numbers rather than numbers themselves. But I know what it says from memory, the way you remember the details of an ordinary day that turned out to be the last ordinary day you ever had. 2 beers, 1 plate of rice, and whatever. The table cost 11 pesos and change. Most expensive meal of my life in the sense that matters. I was sitting in that cantina when it started. I want to be precise about that because there are versions of the story in circulation now that have me doing something more interesting when the thing began. Flying supplies over the Sierra Madre or sitting in some government office in Mexico City or already on the Mesa when first contact was established. None of that is true. I was in a cantina in Chihuahua in July heat that pressed on the building like a hand, drinking beer that was cold enough to matter and thinking about nothing more significant than whether the contract in Hermosillo would cover 3 months of expenses or 2. I was between jobs. I had been between jobs for 6 weeks, and I was beginning to feel the specific anxiety of a man who earns his living in the air and has been grounded by nothing more dramatic than a shortage of work. My name is Grant Phelan. I was a cargo pilot, past tense. Matters here, and I will explain why before I'm done. At the time I was 34 years old, reasonably competent at my work and possessed of exactly the level of understanding of my place in the universe that a man of 34 with no particular philosophy tends to have. I was here, the world was here. The relationship between me and the world was commercial and occasionally pleasant, and the stars overhead were background scenery rather than something I had any personal stake in. That changed. Here is how. The man's name was Master Sonson, Leland Master Sonson, though he wasn't using the title that afternoon, or possibly wasn't aware he was using anything at all. He came through the cantina door out of the flat white heat of the street with his collar soaked through and his jacket hanging off one shoulder and his eyes focused on a point approximately 3 rooms behind everything he was actually looking at. He was somewhere in his late 40s, and he had the kind of face that had once been orderly, regular features, the residual structure of a man who had once made considered choices about his appearance, but which had recently been through something that had shaken all the pieces slightly loose from their original positions. He sat down at our table. Without being invited, he ordered nothing. He looked at Dorn across the table with the specific intensity of a man who is not seeing the person in front of him, but is using the person in front of him as a surface to project something onto. And then he looked at me. And then he looked at the window behind the bar, and then he settled into a stillness that was in retrospect the first genuinely wrong thing I noticed. That afternoon, the wrong things had been accumulating for about 20 minutes. Before he arrived, Dorn was there with her fiancé Vancroft, who was a man in his 50s with a kind of settled heaviness that money produces in some men, not fat exactly, but padded in a way that suggested a long history of problems solved by checkbook. She was 20 years younger than him and pretty in the specific way that made you wonder, not unkindly, what the arrangement was. Woo was there, Vancroft's man, a compact and quiet figure who had been sitting near the door since we arrived, and who I had assigned without much thought to the category of loyal retainer, PETA. The cantina owner was working a section of bar that he had been working for as long as we'd been sitting there, with the same cloth, the same motion, the circular conviction of a man who finds order in repetition. And there was a woman dancing in the corner. I don't know how to describe what I felt watching her, except to use the vocabulary of what I know, which is machinery. She moved the way a very well-made machine moves. Not beautifully, in the human sense, not with the slight inconsistencies and self-corrections that characterize human grace, but with a precision that was its own category of unsettling, too smooth, too exact. The turns of her wrists in the particular Spanish style she was performing were millimeter perfect on every repetition, the way a clock hand is millimeter perfect, and there was nothing behind the eyes that I could read as the thing behind eyes, the negotiation between intention and execution, the small, ongoing improvisation of being alive in a body. The hair on my forearm stood up and stayed there for the duration. I told myself it was the beer. The beer was cold. The heat outside was substantial. I told myself a lot of things in that cantina that I stopped telling myself later. Her name, I found out eventually, was Tarantella. Master Sanson leaned across the table. He spoke quietly and with the rhythm of a man reciting rather than conversing. Pauses were not the pauses of thought, but the pauses of retrieval, as if he were reading from an internal document. He said that we needed to leave. He said he had a gun and we should not test this claim. He said the plane on the strip behind the cantina, Vancroft's plane, a twin-engine freighter that his pilot had brought from Tucson, needed to be the air inside of 30 minutes, which was a thing no informed man said about any aircraft in that heat on that runway, with a pilot who'd been drinking since noon, which was me. Vancroft said, "See here." Master Sanson put the gun on the table. Under his hand, the barrel pointed at the space between the plates. He said, "The Zarpa Mesa installation is in its final preparation phase. What happens there in the next 48 hours will determine whether anyone sitting at this table has children who grow old. I am not being dramatic. I am describing a material, physical, documented situation. The gun is for the purpose of ensuring that you take me seriously long enough to understand what I am telling you." Then he looked at Dorn. He said, "You are very beautiful." And then he sat back and became a statue. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "What is on Zarpa Mesa?" He looked at me with the kind of focus that has been through something and come out the other side of it. "The most important thing that has happened on this planet in the last 10,000 years," he said, "and it is not happening for our benefit." We flew. The engine was not happy about it. I was not happy about it. The strips was short and the heat made the air thin, and the gun on the table had clarified certain aspects of the decision-making process. But I want to be clear that I had also, by the time we lifted off, developed genuine curiosity about what was on the Mesa. I am not a man who does things purely out of fear. I'm a man who has flown freight through mountain passes in November and landed on strips in the Guatemalan highlands that most fixed wing pilots would look at once and walk away from. I have a functional relationship with situations that reasonable people decline. The gyrompus went wrong somewhere over the first range of hills. I noticed it as a subtle Wrongness in the heading that compounded. Over 20 minutes into something I could no longer ignore, and by the time I'd identified the fault we were committed to the approach the instrument was suggesting rather than the approach I'd have chosen, this was not an accident of the equipment. I know that now. I knew it then, and the way you know things without yet having a framework to know them with, as a feeling with no name attached. Wu had been near the instrument panel before we took off. I filed this and said nothing. The engine on the starboard side began losing power over the second range, which I later attributed to fuel contamination and which I would eventually understand was also not an accident. I put us down on the slope of the way you put a failing aircraft down when the options have narrowed to a small number of bad outcomes. You choose the least bad one with the time you have, and you execute the choice as well as you can manage. We came in hard and fast, and we stopped. The nose was lower than I would have preferred. The windscreen had a crack through it from the lower left corner to the upper right that I noticed because I am a pilot and I noticed these things even when other people are screaming. Jan was screaming, the nurse she had come on as Vancraftoff's personal medical attendant, a thin woman in her 40s with a precise manner that I had liked, was screaming and holding her wrist against her chest, a minor injury from the impact. Dorn was not screaming. She was checking herself for damage with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been in situations before. Master Sonson was looking out the window at the mesa. He said, "We are here." He said it the way a man says a thing that is simultaneously the worst and best possible outcome. "We are here. We made it. We are in the place where the bad thing is." I pulled everyone out and took an inventory, and the inventory was one cracked windscreen, bruised wrist, one man whose gun was still in his hand, one woman who was looking at the mesa with more interest than fear, one man whose money had bought this airplane and who was currently white around the lips, one man who had been near the instrument panel and who was now standing slightly apart from the group and looking at the ridge line, and one strip of sky above the me that contained on the east face of the ridge the figure of a woman standing with the absolute stillness of something that had been there long before we arrived and expected to be there long after. Tarantella, she had arrived before us. I did not ask how we made camp as the light went red and then bronze and then blue-gray and then dark. Vankfra had a supply case in the cargo hold that included food and blankets and, mercifully, a lantern. Master Sonson sat slightly apart from the group and stared at the fire with an expression of a man doing complex arithmetic. I checked the plane. Firm is my assessment that it would not fly without components it did not have, and then sat down and began a different kind of inventory. What I had: a fire, 3 days of emergency rations from the aircraft survival kit, 2 flare guns, a signal pistol, a first aid kit, a tool kit with basic hand tools, and a multimeter, the fire extinguisher, mounted by the cargo door, which I unclipped and set to one side with no specific plan but a general sense that it might be useful. What I didn't have: a working aircraft, communications with anything outside the mesa, certainty about what was on the mesa besides us in Tarantella, and the questions that Master Sonson kept not quite finishing answering. I asked him then to finish answering them. He talked for 3 hours. Doran and Wu listened. Vancraftoff fell asleep or performed sleeping, which served the same functional purpose. Fire went down and I built it back up. And Master Sanson talked. The name Arana, derived from the Spanish for spider. The man who used it had been born with a different name in a different country, and had arrived at this mesa and this work by a route that Master Sanson described as brilliant and singular, and, at the end, wrong in the fundamental way. That brilliance without context is sometimes wrong. He had been publishing theoretical work for 15 years on the cognitive architecture of colonial arachnids, the distributed intelligence of spider colonies, the upper theoretical bound of what that intelligence could achieve if the developmental constraints were removed and the architecture were edited deliberately upward rather than drifted laterally over generations. The papers were fringe, citations were sparse, and came almost entirely from within a small circle of researchers who were willing to take seriously ideas that the broader community found both speculative and vaguely distasteful. The suggestion that spider cognition was underestimated, that the colonial architecture was proto-civilizational rather than merely complex, that what looked like instinct was the surface expression of something more organized underneath. Masterson had been one of 6 researchers willing to engage with the full body of work. He had read every paper, he had followed the citations backward through the literature. He had arrived after 2 years of careful reading at a conclusion that he had not shared with his institution because there was no language in institutional science for what he had concluded, which was these papers are not theoretical. The man who wrote them has done these experiments. The man who wrote them has results, and the results, if genuine, represent a category of finding that does not fit in any existing framework for understanding what life on this planet is and what it means. He had contacted Urania. He had traveled to Zarpa Mesa. He had arrived expecting to find a brilliant eccentric in a converted outbuilding running crude experiments on farm spiders, and he had found a laboratory. He paused. When he said the word, he let it stand alone for a moment, the way you give a word room when it doesn't mean the ordinary thing. The laboratory was a forge. It was a precision biological engineering facility built inside the Mesa Rock, equipped with instrumentation that Master Sanson described in careful clinical language, and that I, listening, filed under impossible, and then, because I am a practical man, amended to impossible by us with what we know, using what we have: the synthesis tanks, the preparation chambers, the neural binding apparatus that Master Sanson described in terms I half understood, and that door, who turned out to have a graduate background in communications engineer, listened to with an expression of focused attention the specimens, both the large ones which Master Sanson described as biological enforcement constructs, and the refined ones which were tarantella, and the others like her, which were something else entirely. He didn't design them, Masterson said. He found them. The design is theirs. The surgery is his. He has been refining the delivery mechanism, the interface between their biology and the operational context for 40 years. The women you see are the current version of the refined product. The large specimens are the raw biological material in its less processed form. Arana is in the terminology I eventually came to use a licensed contractor. He has been given a toolkit, a mandate, and a performance Standard, Wu said, and a timeline. Master Sanson looked at him. The fire moved between them, you knew. Master Sanson said. Wu looked at the fire. He said nothing. There is a governing body, Master Sanson continued. After a moment, he said it carefully. The way you say a thing that you have been saying to yourself for a long time, and are saying to another person for the first time, testing whether the words will survive the transfer, multi-esses. Old, I mean old in the way that makes our oldest institutions look like things that happened last Tuesday. They have been aware of this planet for approximately 2 centuries by our reckoning, which in the scale of their operations is a short observation window. They have a taxonomy, a classification system for what they observe on inhabited worlds, and this planet's dominant species, us, has been assessed and classified, Dorn said. Classified. How he looked at her. He had been dreading this part or something that looked like dreading. The word in their formal taxonomy translates imprecisely. The closest English equivalent is something between infestation and invasive species. Biological presence that colonizes beyond sustainable ratio, alters its environment past recovery, and if left unchecked will apply this pattern to every available surface it can reach. He paused. They have used this classification before on other worlds, other species. They have a protocol for it. The protocol is what Irana represents. Vankeraftoft was awake. He had been awake, I think, for some time. He said from across the fire, "You're telling us we're being exterminated. I'm telling you the process has been initiated. The advanced stage. Reconnaissance, attrition of intellectual resources, degradation of organized response capacity is in its final phase. The next stage involves the Council's formal attention, which in practical terms means a level of intervention that the advanced stage is designed to make unnecessary by preemptively rendering the subject species incapable of coherent response. Incapable of coherent response, I said. Dead or functionally equivalent, I sat. With that, the fire popped. Something moved on the ridge and then was still. I said, "There's a receiver in the wreck." Masterson looked at me. I brought it from the mesa, from Arana's facility. During my first visit, before I understood fully what I was taking, it is a piece of the communication infrastructure they use. It receives signal on frequencies that our instruments don't cover. It also, if the formatting conventions Arana showed me can be reverse engineered, transmits, and you brought it with you. I brought it because it is the only physical artifact I have from the installation, and because I thought at the time that it could be used to reach someone in a position to act on the information. I have since reconsidered who would be in a position to act on this information. Who? Dorn said. He looked around the fire. People who are already here, he said. Receiver was in the wreck under a section of loose paneling where Master Sanson had secured it before we took off. It was the size and general dimensions of a shortwave radio, but was constructed of components that were not any alloy or substrate I could identify, with a display surface that was not glass and controls that responded to proximity rather than pressure. It powered on when Master Sanson held it, which was the first indication that it was keyed to something biological rather than mechanical. His proximity, specifically his particular biological signature, the way certain locks respond to a voice print, he worked with it. Through most of the next day, Dorn sat beside him, and they developed over the course of 8 hours the beginning of a working vocabulary, not the content, which required the full decryption effort that came later, but the structural logic of how the transmissions were formatted, the mathematical conventions underlying the signal, the way the protocol encoded certainty versus query, statement versus observation, the routine handshake of an operational report versus the different character of a command from a higher level of the hierarchy. That second day was also when we lost George. He had gone to check the perimeter of the camp in the late morning, which was something he'd been doing at intervals as a way of managing his own fear, the physical activity providing the illusion of agency. He did not come back from the late morning check. We found him at the base of a rock formation 200 YD from camp, seated with his back against the stone, his hands in his lap, his face wearing the expression of a man who has just received very disappointing news and has not yet finished processing it. There was no injury visible. There was no sign of struggle. His heart had stopped, and that was the end of George. Masterson looked at him and said, "The venom operates on the autonomic nervous system. The synthetic version Arana has developed is considerably more precise than the natural compound. Death is rapid, neurologically quiet, and leaves minimal external evidence. From a protocol standpoint, it is the preferred method for the advanced stages attrition function." He said it with the flat precision of a man quoting a paper he'd read, because that is what he was doing. He had read Arana's technical documentation. He had read it with the understanding of a biologist, which meant he had understood what the words actually described. I buried George in the afternoon. It took a long time in the Mesa Rock. Darren helped. We did not say anything over the grave because neither of us had language for the category of thing we were burying him in. That night, Master Sonson finished the first layer of the receiver's decryption and read us what was there. We were around the fire. The shapes on the ridge had multiplied from the single figure we'd seen on arrival to something I estimated at between 8 and 12 distinct presences, though the dark and the distance made accuracy difficult. Vancroft had his flask. Darren had her hands around her knees. I had the dry chemical extinguisher beside me, which I had been thinking about with increasing specificity over the previous 12 hours. Masterson read the signal said, translated through his partial decryption and Doreen's structural analysis, and filtered through the accumulated understanding of 2 days of careful work. Zarpus Station Advance assessment complete. Subject species categorized confirmed. Infestation class tertiary grade. Breeding rate exceeds 3rd standard. Local cognitive density above projected parameters. Recommend upgraded attrition targeting of scientific research infrastructure. Phase 2 initiation authorized upon completion of advanced stage. The Council has voted. Motion carried. Without dissent. Eradication mandate active. The Council has voted. Motion carried without dissent. I listened to him, read that, and I felt something happen in my chest that I cannot describe accurately using the vocabulary I have, because the vocabulary I have was developed in a world where that kind of thing didn't happen. It wasn't fear. Fear is about your own survival, and it has a specific texture, a specific Relationship to time, it is present. Tense, urgent, focused on the immediate. What I felt was something larger than fear and slower than fear. It was the recognition that the world I had understood, the one where we were the only kind of intelligence that mattered, the one where the stars were backdrop, and the concerns of a cargo pilot in July heat were a legitimate category of concerns. Was not the world, it had never been the world was something else entirely, and we were a line item in it, and the line item had just been updated. They had looked at everything we'd ever built, every city and road and argument and song and child and grave, every war we'd survived and rebuilt, after every winter crossing and ocean, passage and mountain we'd clawed over on, the possibility of something better on the other side. They had looked at all of it, and they had called it an infestation. They had assembled their council and held their vote, and the motion had carried without dissent. I sat with that for a long time. Then I asked Master Sonson where the laboratory was. He blinked. He looked at me the way people look at you when you have moved to a part of a conversation they hadn't expected to reach. You want to the laboratory? Where is it on the mesa? Give me specific directions. He gave me the directions. He did it with the precision of a man who had memorized a route out of the kind of fear that memorizes things against future necessity. The cut in the rock on the north face 40 ft below the second ridge line, the door that was not a door but a panel of stone that moved on a counterweight mechanism, the corridor beyond it 20 ft to the main chamber, then a branch left to the synthesis cove where the preparation compounds were stored and processed. Vancroft said it was suicide. He said it with the conviction of a man who had organized his entire life around the accurate identification of bad bets, and in the narrow framework of what we knew and what seemed possible. He was not wrong. I acknowledged this. I also noted that the alternative, waiting on the mesa for the advanced stage to complete its work on the remaining members of our group, had its own actuarial problems. Wu was gone by morning. He had slipped away sometime in the third watch, moving with the care of a man who knew the ground and knew the watchers and had made a prior arrangement. I had noticed him leave and said nothing. I wanted to see which direction he chose. He chose the ridge. He went to meet the thing on the ridge, and the thing on the ridge was not Tarantella. Vancroft went after him. I followed Vancroft not because I cared about Vancroft's well-being in that moment, but because Vancroft was a variable I could not leave uncontrolled. What we found on the lower ridge was Wu in a conversation that used no sound. He was standing at the base of the ridge face, and the thing standing opposite him was one of the older ones, older in the sense that the refinements showed in a different direction, the proportions that Arana had been moving toward with Tarantella pushed further in a way that clarified what the refinements were for. The eyes were wider set and unblinking with the mechanical precision of something that sees differently than we do, tracking separately, each eye its own instrument. The stillness was more absolute than Tarantella's. It read to something very old in my brain that I don't have a name for, as a presence that had decided to be still rather than a presence that happened to be standing. Vancroft said Wu and LT Unk and GT's name. His voice cracked slightly on it. The thing turned its head toward the sound. The movement was smooth and exact and covered exactly the Degrees of arc required to reorient its primary attention, not a millimeter more or less, and I watched it do this and felt that cold stone in the chest again. Heavier than before, Vanker ran. He ran back down the slope with the specific mechanics of a man who has bypassed rational decision-making and landed in pure animal response, which is not a criticism. The animal response was not wrong in that moment. I did not run. I want to be honest about why. It was not courage, it was the recognition. The 3 seconds between Vancroft running and me deciding what to do, that running would not change my situation in any way that mattered, and that standing still was not worse and might be informative, so I stood still and it looked at me. The assessment took somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes. I cannot be more precise than that because time does not behave correctly when something is examining you that way, examining you the way you examine a component before you decide whether it's serviceable or scrap. I felt it as pressure, not physical, not painful, but pressure in the sense of attention, weight, the specific quality of being studied by something that is very good at studying. Then it looked away. Wu was still standing there. He had the expression of a man who has concluded a transaction. I walked back down the slope. Vancroft we found half a mile down, sitting against a rock with his legs out in front of him and his pulse running and his mind somewhere beyond the accessible edge of conversation. He answered questions with the pattern of answers rather than the content, the right shape of a response, the rhythm of reply, but nothing inside it that connected to what you'd asked. He had been somewhere on that ridge that wasn't a location you could walk him back from. He survived 2 more days, then he was another grave in Mazarok that left Master Sanson and Darin and me. I spent the 3rd night building what I have subsequently described to several different audiences in several different rooms as an improvised device, because improvised is accurate and device is accurate, and the other words for it raise procedural concerns institutions. And I understand, but that were not my primary concern on a mesa in Mexico, with 2 people and a fire and the receiver telling us that the Phase 2 timeline had been accelerated. Masterson described the synthesis compounds from memory. He described them as a biologist with 15 years of relevant reading, which meant he described them precisely. Molecular weight stability under heat, the specific interaction profile of the growth accelerants with the neural binding agents. I listened with the part of my mind that has been working the numbers for 15 years of aviation, the part that knows what happens when certain energies meet in certain volumes, that has run those calculations in cockpits and on runways, and once in a hangar in Mazatlan at 2 in the morning with a fuel line that was not cooperating, the dry chemical from the extinguisher, the flare casing stripped to their chemical content and repacked, the signal pistol's propellant charge, carefully separated wire from the aircraft's instrument panel, 10 FT of it, the timer mechanism from my watch, which had stopped in the crash but whose internal gearing was intact and could be set and wound. Dorn held the light. Master Merson handed me components and answered the questions I asked without asking the ones he could see I was already answering. She did not tell me not to do this. She had assessed the situation and reached the same conclusion I had reached, which was that the alternative to doing something difficult and uncertain was waiting for the certain thing to finish, and the certain thing that was finishing was us. At 2:00 in the morning I said, I need to go in alone. Dorn looked at me in the way that people look at you when they have already argued the argument in their own head and lost it and are deciding whether to run it aloud anyway. She ran it aloud. She said it was stupid. She said 2 people were better than 1 on any operation, which was true in the abstract. I said 2 people means 2 signatures, 2 sets of sounds, 2 routes to account for 1 person in and out fast on a known route is a simpler problem than 2. Master Sonson's route description is exact. I have it mapped. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, you'd better come out. I said, that's the plan. The approach to the laboratory was a cut in the northeast rock that ran 40 ft below the second ridge line, exactly as Master Sonson had described. The night was cold in the way desert nights are cold, the heat gone as if it had never existed, the stars overhead with the clarity of high altitude and no competing light. I moved carefully and without a light, using the stats and the texture of the ground to stay on the route I'd memorized. Tarantella was at the entrance, not guarding it, occupying it the way a natural feature occupies a landscape, as if she had been there before the stone and would remain after it. Her eyes found me in the dark with the mechanical precision I'd watched on the ridge, and they tracked me as I approached, and I could feel the filing happening, the same categorization that the older one had applied on the ridge. I said, I need to see Arana. She moved aside. I have thought about that moment many times, why she moved, why the door in effect opened. The answer I've arrived at is the most unsettling part of the entire account, more unsettling than the things in the dark or the words from the receiver or Vancroft's vacant face in his last 2 days. She moved because the protocol's model of what I was did not include an action I could take that required stopping. I was infestation. I was categorized infestation in the 4th quarter of an advanced stage. Doesn't plan, it reacts and scatters and dies in small increments that get filed as progress metrics. I was relying on their certainty about that. I was betting everything on the gap between knowing what a thing is and understanding what it does. Arana was in the inner chamber at a workbench smaller than I'd built him in my mind from Master Sonson's descriptions, a slight, precise man with the careful economy of movement of someone who spends a great deal of time in close proximity to things that do not forgive carelessness. He looked up when I entered. He assessed me with eyes that had, after 40 years of working with the things he'd worked with, acquired something of their quality, that mechanical precision of focus, that sense of examination rather than perception. He said, you are the pilot. I am. He sat down what he was working with. He folded his hands on the workbench. He said, you understand the nature of what is occurring here. Master Sonson told you. He told me then. You understand that you are witnessing the execution of a process that has been successfully completed on 7 other inhabited worlds in 300 years of council operations. The process has a documented success rate. He paused. I say this not to discourage you. I say it because the facts are the facts, and I have spent 40 years in the service of accurate understanding. The outcome is not variable. The timeline is variable, and the Council has noted that your species Resilience exceeds the baseline. Projection which has resulted in adjustments to the timeline, but the outcome is not variable, I said. I appreciate the assessment. He looked at me with something that had curiosity in it, not warmth. I don't think warmth was a thing he had access to after 40 years. But genuine intellectual interest. You did not come here to negotiate. Your posture is not the posture of negotiation. No, then why did you come? I said, to make sure you understand what you've been studying. I had set the device in the synthesis alcove while we were talking. The alcove was exactly where Master Sonson's description had placed it. The timer was set 4 minutes. I knew the route. I had run it in my head 50 times. I walked out of the inner chamber. The corridor to the entrance was 20 ft. Tarantella was in the corridor. She had processed something. Some element of what had just happened had updated the categorization. My movement, the direction I'd come from, some component of my body chemistry that our senses were capable of reading in ways mine were not, and the update had flagged a discrepancy. She moved to intercept. She was faster than me by margin that I had estimated, and that turned out to be accurate, which is to say significant. She was between me and the entrance in a movement that I had the fraction of a second to observe before I was committed to working with it. I went around her through the geometry of the corridor and the specific physics of two bodies in a narrow space, which is a problem I solved not through grace. I have never been graceful, but through the pilot's relationship to space, which is about angles and vectors and the minimum clearance required to move a body of specific dimensions through a defined opening at a defined speed. I made the cut in the cold air of the north face and the slope beyond it with the sound of rock moving behind me as something came through the entrance that was not Tarantella. The slope was dark and steep, and I moved down it the way you move down a dark, steep slope with the knowledge that falling is worse than slow, fast enough, careful enough, the calculation running the whole time the device worked. I say it simply because it is the relevant fact, and because the alternatives it didn't work. It worked partially. It worked in a way that produced consequences I hadn't calculated, would require a different story. The synthesis alcove vented into the inner chamber. The inner chamber had 2 structural timber supports 40 years old, load-bearing in the specific way that Master Sonson had described. The combination of events that followed was consistent with my professional assessment of what would happen when those elements met. The mesa shook in the localized way that contained geological events shake things. Compression, a settling, a sound that was more felt than heard. The cut in the rock exhaled a pressure that hit me between the shoulder blades and sat me down hard on the slope, and the stars wheeled, and then it was quiet. I ran an inventory of working body parts, all present, several objecting. I got up. The ridge line above had changed. Section had dropped, the forge was gone. I made the rest of the slope in the dry wash in what I estimated at 5 minutes of careful movement in the dark, and Darren was there, and Master Sonson was beside her with the receiver in his lap. And she stood up when I came over the lip of the wash and put her hand on my arm for one moment briefly, the way you confirm a solid surface before you trust your weight to it. Then you see she let go. Master Sonson said the receive signal has changed how there's a query. Zarpa Station report status. He looked at the display. Zarpa Station. The Council requests confirmation of Phase 2. Initiation. The transmission repeats at 6-minute intervals. He paused. There is no response from the station. I looked at the changed ridge line against the stars. How many other stations? I said. Based on the signal architecture, the number of distinct handshake addresses you've identified in the transmission protocol. He was quiet for a moment. Between 40 and 60, the distribution pattern in the transmission delays suggests global coverage. Every major landmass. I sat down on the bank of the wash. The stars were very clear. The receiver pulsed its query into the dark, patient, expecting the answer that didn't come. 40 to 60, a protocol that had been running for 2 centuries, a council that had voted without dissent, and one station that had stopped reporting. 1 out of 40 to 60, not a victory, not remotely a victory, but a data point. Gap in the record. An anomaly in a system that was not supposed to produce anomalies because the system was designed for a subject species that didn't do the anomalous thing. I thought about that sitting on the bank while the cold came up from the desert floor and the receiver sent its unanswered query into the night. We were found 3 days later by a man named Dan who ran supply routes out of Chihuahua and covered the Mesa Road twice a week. He was a practical man of middle age who had seen enough of the Sonoran Desert to maintain a careful skepticism about dramatic stories told by people found wandering. In it, he listened to the summary of what we told him and dismissed most of it in the way sensible people dismiss things that require a fundamental revision of their understanding of reality. And he drove us back to Chihuahua in his truck with the receiver wrapped in Master Sonson's jacket in the cargo bed. I didn't push the story in Chihuahua. There was no language yet for what the story was, no framework in which to place it that would survive the translation from Mesa to civilization. The story would find its legs or it wouldn't. In the meantime, the receiver existed, and the receiver was physical. And physical things can be examined. What followed is the part of the account that history will probably remember as a sequence of institutional steps and diplomatic achievements, because history tends to remember the architecture rather than the arguments. And there were many arguments, 11 years of them in rooms that smelled of government issue, coffee, and the specific anxiety of people who are trying to contain something that is not containable. Arguments about who had authority over the information, who had authority over the receiver, who had authority over the decisions that flowed from understanding the receiver, who would speak for the planet if speaking became necessary. Masterson contributed what he could for the first 4 years until the neurological effects of whatever Arana's infiltrators had done to him in his first visit, and during the days on the Mesa began to make sustained technical work impossible. He became an advisor in the older sense of the word, a person whose value is in what they witnessed rather than what they can currently produce. I visited him twice a year in the facility in New Mexico, where he had good care and a window that looked out on mountains, and on clear days a sky that he could look at with the knowledge of what it contained. Doran's background in communications engineering turned out to be the single most important credential in the first phase of the receiver analysis. She was central to the structural decoding effort for 4 years, and then to the protocol analysis for 3 more, and she was in the room when the first human transmission was formatted in the Council's own mathematical language and sent on the Council's own frequency. I was not in that room. I was in the hallway with bad coffee and a window that looked at a parking lot. Someone came to get me, and I walked in, and the room had the silence of a place where something very large has just happened, and everyone is still deciding what the correct response is. I looked at the displays on the receiver. It had been integrated into a larger system by then, surrounded by human instrumentation that read its output in real time, and I read the query response that was coming back from the relay. 4 months start to finish from our transmission to the response. 4 months of silence in which I had thought occasionally that we had simply failed to be heard or had been heard and categorized as noise. 4 months of the kind of waiting that is different from patience. Patience is chosen. Waiting is endured. The response was 3 times the length of our transmission, 2 weeks to fully decode what it said in the stripped version that was read to me in the room with the mountains outside. The Council has received the anomalous transmission. The Council notes that no species in the infestation category has previously achieved protocol channel access. The Council requests clarification of the mechanism by which this was accomplished. The Council wishes to understand the nature of the anomaly, and at the end, in a formulation that Master Sonson, when it was read to him over the phone in his facility in New Mexico, said carried something he translated as institutional uncertainty, a thing their formal language had structures for indicating, and that had apparently not been used frequently. The Council is revising its assessment timeline. The Council acknowledges that Zarpa Station has not reported in 11 years. The Council acknowledges that the transmission was received in correct protocol format from within the subject species technological range, revising the assessment timeline, not the outcome. They were clear about the outcome. The outcome they maintained was not variable, but the timeline. The timeline was being revised because the timeline had been built on a model of what we were, and the model had produced a prediction, and the prediction had not been met. One infestation species had gotten into their station, understood the station's function within 11 years of finding it, learned to use the station's own communication infrastructure, and sent a message on the Council's own frequency requesting to be heard. I have thought about what that revision meant, about what it costs a body that has operated for 300 years without being required to revise a timeline, to revise a timeline. The documents that followed, and there were many over the 6 years since the channel opened, have a quality in their language that our translators describe as unprecedented. Not the words themselves, but the register, the way the Council writes when it is writing something it has not written before. They called us an infestation. The word still stands in their taxonomy. They have not retracted it. We have not asked them to. It is accurate in the way clinical diagnosis is accurate, and accuracy matters more than flattery when the people with whom you're negotiating are 300 years old and have dealt with 7 other worlds through the same protocol and know the difference between a thing that's true and a thing that's comfortable. What we have asked them to do is look at the data, look at the 11 Years between the station going dark and the transmission arriving on there. Frequency, look at the mechanism. Look at what a species that has spent 12,000 years surviving things that should have finished it, rebuilding after things that should have broken it, moving toward things that were past the horizon. And that most reasonable assessment said, we're unreachable. Look at what that species does when you tell it that the assessment has been made and the vote has been taken and the motion carried. Without dissent, the formal channel has been open for 6 years. I am not one of the representatives working in it. I am too old for the process and too much of a symbol, which is a strange thing to be. The people doing the work are younger and more patient than I am, and they are doing it well, and I trust them to do it better than I could. What I contribute now is simpler. When the work is hard and the process is slow and the distance between where we are and where we need to be seems geological, I am available. I am the man who was in the wash at the base of Zarpa Mesa. I am the man who held the receiver while it asked its unanswered question into the dark. I am the man who walked into a functioning installation with an improvised device built from a fire extinguisher and a pilot's watch and walked out of it and sat on the bank of a dry wash and looked at the stars and felt something settle into place. 42 stations still in the network. We know their locations. Work of those 42 is a different problem from the work of the channel, and I trust the people working both problems to understand the relationship between them. Leverage is the word that keeps appearing in those rooms in the discussions I'm invited to sit in on, but not to lead. We have leverage that no species in the infestation category has ever had. We are using it carefully. We are using it in the way that people who have been careful about very little historically tend to use things when the stakes finally clarify what careful means. I still have the receipt from the cantina. I keep it in my left breast pocket. Some mornings when the coffee is bad and the work is slow and the gap between where we are and where we need to be makes itself felt as a weight rather than a measurement, I take it out and hold it between 2 fingers and think about that afternoon, the heat, the shade, the beer cold enough to matter, the woman dancing wrong in the corner with the hair on my forearm, standing up, and a name for the wrongness that I didn't have yet, the man who walked in out of the desert with everything he knew rearranged in his face, the table and the gun on the table and the question underneath. Everything that nobody asked aloud, because nobody had the language for it. Yet what are we? That was the question. The council thought they'd answered. Infestation, tertiary grade breeding. Rate exceeds 3rd standard, motion. Carried without dissent. They were not wrong. That's the part I want people to understand when they hear this account. The part I keep returning to because it matters. They were not wrong about what we are. The classification fits. We are too numerous and too persistent and too willing to go past the places where the sensible calculus says stop, and we alter every surface we touch past the point of easy recovery. And if you look at us from a sufficient distance and with a sufficient breadth of reference, the word infestation is not an insult. It is a description. What they got wrong was the implication. They have the protocol because in 7 previous applications, infestation led to a predictable conclusion. The subject species reacted, scattered, resisted the local and uncoordinated way that species resist when they don't have the framework to understand what they're resisting, and eventually the attrition completed its work and the assessment was confirmed and the timeline closed 77. Without exception, without a data point. That complicated the model. We are the data point that complicated the model. Not because we are braver or wiser or more worthy of the stars than the 7 species who preceded us in this particular council file. I don't know anything about those species, and I hold no brief for human exceptionalism in the cosmic sense. We are what the assessment says we are. We are also the thing that looked at the assessment and decided it was a starting point for a negotiation. That is what I remember from the wash-in. The dark with the receiver and the unanswered query and the stars overhead. And the smell of a sandstone stone forge. That wasn't there anymore. Not courage. Not the big emotion that gets written into the versions of the story that I am not responsible for, just the specific stubbornness of a species that has never, in its documented or undocumented history, accepted a final answer about what it was capable of from any source, internal or external, on any timeline. The motion carried without dissent. We received the memo. We are composing our response. There is one more thing I have not described, and it is the thing I am most often asked about when people sit down with me for these conversations. They want to know what it felt like, not the operational facts, not the timeline, not the receiver and the response end, the 42 stations still running. They want to know what it felt like to sit in a dry wash in the Mexican desert at 3:00 in the morning with 2 other people, and the knowledge that the vote had been taken and the mandate was active and the thing you were had been named by something that had seen 7 other worlds and had never been surprised. I tell them the honest answer, which is I don't have a clean word for it. I've tried a few. Grief doesn't fit because grief is about loss, and what I felt in that wash was not primarily about loss, though loss was part of the inventory. The word that comes closest is clarification. The moment when a diagnostic that has been running in the background without resolution suddenly resolves to a definite output, not pleasant but specific, and specific is a kind of relief after the fog of uncertainty. I will take specific over fog every time. What was clarified in the wash was the context, the full context of what we were in, which had been enormous and vague in the way that enormous things are vague when you are inside them without adequate distance to see the shape. The receiver gave us the shape. The receiver told us here is the size of the thing you have been living inside without knowing it. Here is the assessment. Here is the timeline they have built for the conclusion. Once you have the shape, you can work with it. You can measure yourself against it. You can ask the question that I believe is the most specifically human question, the one we have been asking in one form or another since we first looked at things that were bigger than us and understood that size was not the only relevant variable. What do we actually have and what can we do with it? In the wash at 3:00 in the morning, what I actually had was 2 people, one of whom understood the receiver's architecture better than anyone alive outside of Masterson, and one of whom had just demonstrated that the installation's physical security had a gap it was not designed to have. One device deployed and confirmed functional, the Mesa quiet above us, the receiver repeating its unanswered query at 6-minute intervals. and 42 more stations globally, distributed running on the assumption that the subject species did not know. The protocol existed, that assumption was now false. We had done that too. People in a pilot's watch and a fire extinguisher had done that. I did not feel victorious in the wash. The versions of this account that have circulated assign an emotional register to that moment that was not present. What I felt was tired, the specific tiredness of a man who has been running on adrenaline and calculation for 72 hours and has just come down from both. I felt the weight of the graves on the mesa, which was a weight that had no mechanical solution and would have to be carried differently than the other problems. I felt the cold clarity I associate with the moments in a long flight when the weather has been bad and you have made a decision you cannot unmake and you are waiting to learn whether it was right. Dorn sat beside me for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "What do they do when I station stops responding?" "I don't know exactly. Masterson might know more. Whatever they do, they'll do it at their speed." "Yes, which is not our speed." "That's an advantage." She looked at the changed ridge line. "Is it enough of one?" The honest answer was that I did not know. The operational answer was it's what we have, so we work with it. That is, I think, the most concentrated version of what I have been saying in longer forms to more people in more rooms over the last 11 years. It's what we have, so we work with it. It is not a philosophy. It is not a strategic position. It is the operational reality of a species that has never had sufficient resources for any of the problems it decided to solve, and that has solved them anyway, imperfectly at cost with losses it grieves in the moment and then incorporates and moves forward from, because the alternative to moving forward is staying in the place where the loss is, and staying in that place does not recover the loss. It only adds a second loss on top of the first. The Council's model was not built for this. Their model was calibrated to species that, when confronted with a terminal assessment, responded terminally. That is, not a judgment. Terminal assessments produce terminal responses by definition. The model was empirically sound. 7 worlds, 7 confirmations, no exceptions. We are world 8. We found the gap between being assessed and being told we had been assessed. The gap is not large in their terms, 11 years, which is nothing in the scale their operations run on, but 11 years was enough. 11 years produced the receiver analysis, the signal architecture map, the station network topology, and one human transmission in correct protocol format on the Council's own frequency. 11 years produced the anomaly their formal language had to stretch to accommodate. Masterson died 4 years after the channel opened. I was there. I had been there for 3 days, which was enough time for the conversations that needed to happen and for the long silences that are their own kind of conversation. He died in the facility in New Mexico with the mountains outside his window on a morning that was very clear. Before the last day, during one of the silences, he said, "Arana told me the outcome was not variable, only the timeline." I believed him when he said it. I understood the scope of the operation and the history behind it, and I believed that the outcome was not variable. He paused. He was looking at the ceiling with the focused quality of a man whose mind is very active and whose body is very tired, and who has made the practical accommodation between them. I was wrong. in the way that accurate data produces wrong conclusions when the model doesn't account for all the variables, I said. The model didn't account for what happens when the subject species reads. The model. He made a sound that had the shape of a laugh. That is the gap. That is the precise gap they've been working with for 11 years, the difference between observing a thing in ignorance and telling the thing that it's being observed. The species they modeled from were in ignorance. We are not in ignorance. No, they will not make that error again. No, he looked at the clear sky through the window for a while. Then he said, we had better have done enough with the head start. I said, we're working on it. He died the next morning. I sat with him for a while after in the room with the mountains and the particular silence of a place that has recently held someone and has not yet finished adjusting. Then I drove back to the city and went to work. Receipt goes with me. It has been with me since the cantina. I have transferred it from jacket to jacket for 11 years. Carefully aware of its fragility, aware that the ink has gone past reading, but that the paper is what I need rather than the figures on it. What I understand now that I did not understand then is that the receipt is not about the cantina. It never was. It is about the last moment before the map existed, the last afternoon in which I moved through the world with no sense of its actual dimensions, its actual stakes, its actual relationship to everything beyond the strip of sky I could see from a cockpit window. It is about the version of myself that believed his concerns were appropriately scaled to reality when they were in fact microscopic in comparison to what reality contained. Knowing the map is better, even with the weight of knowing it, even with the cost. You cannot navigate to a destination you cannot see, and we were always navigating toward this, toward the stars that contain what they contain, toward the council and the protocol and the 42 stations, toward the moment when the subject species was no longer ignorant of its own status. We are navigating now with the map open imperfectly at cost in the way we have always done things, which is to say, not cleanly, not without argument, not without the full range of human dysfunction applied to a problem that requires better than our average, but moving. That is the non-negotiable part, the one variable in the terminal assessment that the model could not account for because the model had never needed to. We are moving. The stars are clear tonight. They are the same stars they always were, containing the same things they always contained. And knowing what they contain is better than not knowing, even now, even here. Even with the weight of everything the knowledge costs, we receive the memo. We are still here. That is where the story is not finished. It will not be finished in my lifetime, and probably not in the lifetime of anyone currently working the problem, and that is the correct scale for it, because the council has been working their version of this problem for 300 years, and we are negotiating with them about the terms of a future that is genuinely long. But that is where the story is. In the movement, in the refusal to accept the timeline they assigned us, in the specific stubbornness of a thing that was classified as infestation and decided that meant it had more surface area to work with, the receipt, the cantina, the beer and the shade, and 11 pesos in the last ordinary afternoon. And then the rest of it, we are still composing our reply. I want to say one thing about the people who have not been named in this account, because the account as I have given it is necessarily shaped by the vantage point of the man telling it, and the man telling it was a cargo pilot who was good at specific things and limited in others, and the things he was limited in were covered by people whose names deserve to be said. The first team to independently verify the receiver's signal architecture was 7 people, working out of an institution I am not at liberty to name. They worked for 14 months without certainty that what they were working on was real, because the alternative explanation that Master Sonson and Dorn and I had fabricated an extraordinarily sophisticated hoax using equipment of unknown origin for no clear motive was more consistent with prior experience than the actual explanation, and 14 months is the time it took for the evidence to accumulate past the threshold of alternative explanations. The woman who led that team is named Reyes. She is 46 years old now, and she runs the primary translation and protocol analysis center, which has a staff of over 200 and which has produced the entire body of work that makes the current formal channel possible. She has met the council transmissions with a combination of precision and patience that I observe with the specific respect of someone who knows what they are watching. There is a man named OOA who did the mathematical work underlying the first human transmission, the formulation of a message in the council's protocol language using their mathematical conventions pitched at the correct abstraction level to be received as intentional communication rather than noise. This was a problem that took 5 years to solve from the moment we understood it was the problem. Solved it. He is quiet and works odd hours in. When I have been in the same room as him, I have had the consistent impression of being near something, operating at a level I cannot fully observe, the way you feel near very large machinery that is mostly internal. There are the 43 people who have, over the 6 years since the channel opened, served as interpreters and analysts of the council's responses. The council's formal language has structures for which we had no equivalent concepts until those concepts were forced into existence by the need to decode transmissions that required them. There is a word in the council's language that the translation team renders as something like acknowledged but contested, which is a single unit. Their grammar and a phrase in ours, and the distinction between that word and simply acknowledged has been the subject of more than a year of careful work to get right, because the operational implications of misreading it are not trivial. I cite these people not as a list but as a context. The account of what happened on the Mesa is mine, because I was there, and I am apparently the kind of fixed point that an account wants, but the account of what happened after the Mesa belongs to many people, most of whom you will not hear from in the venues where this account is told, because they are busy doing the work that the account was always moving toward. That is as it should be. The pilot who flies the freight is not usually the one who decides where the freight goes or what it means that it arrived. My job was to land the aircraft. I landed at. The people who know what to do with the cargo have been working ever since the formal channel is open. The 42 stations are mapped. The council is revising its timeline. The motion still stands. They have not retracted the vote, but the motion is now in active discussion with the subject species, which is a sentence that could not have been written in any council record in 300 years of protocol operation. We are in the record now. That is enough. That is exactly enough to